Well, I mean, first of all, it's of course it's a lifeline because as an island nation or a remote place itself, Australia also needs shipping. Pacific nations need shipping, and so that it's quite essential that shipping continues. Um, but of course, shipping emissions, like the emissions of everything else, is severely impacting the climate, and that's why these Pacific Island states are calling for very clear science-aligned targets to make sure that we are able to tackle the climate emergency that we're in head on.
So take us through this plan. Is it about reducing those emissions or really taxing the industry to a degree to help with other measures?
The first target and the primary target is to reduce the emissions from shipping to zero. And in order to steer the shipping industry on a 1.5 degree aligned pathway, shipping emissions have to be zero by 2050. But that's not enough. We need very clear intermediary targets, and the science tells us those targets should be at least 37% by 2030, at least 96% by 2040, and then we have a decade to cover those last few percent. Now, alongside that, we need a very clear technical measure that indicates how much emissions we can allow per unit of energy and fuel that is used. But the Pacific Islands have proposed to add an economic measure to speed up the transition and to also close the price gap between the relatively cheap fossil fuels that we use now and the relatively more expensive alternative fuels that are in development and in rollout to decarbonize the industry. So that is the primary target. But the calculations of bodies like the World Bank make it clear that the amount of the levy they propose to cut emissions and to speed up the process is less than what is needed to really give a clear price signal to the industry. So Pacific states have therefore proposed to use whatever extra is levied through that measure, that would be used for small island developing states and least developed countries alongside other developing countries to make sure that they can afford to adapt and mitigate the climate effects that we're dealing with. So that is their proposal.
So it brings us to this $100 a tonne. So it's not just for Pacific nations, although it's been put forward by Pacific nations. This is a plan to potentially benefit many countries that are impacted, and many of them are, as you point out, still developing.
Absolutely. And the main thing is here that because of how the shipping industry works, we need a global rule that applies to every country, every ship, every company that operates ships or owns the cargo. Everyone has to follow the same rules and pay the same price on emissions. But of course, that price will impact poorer countries more than it will rich countries who can quite easily afford to pay a little bit extra. And that's why the Pacific Islands have proposed to use some of those revenues so poorer countries can help finance that transition. And that is alongside speeding up the transition, getting to zero as quickly as possible, then the third real objective of that levy.
Yeah. So we're hearing reports that Australia is not with this plan, and they're siding with countries like China and Russia. China is a big exporter, and I would imagine it's the shipping industry that does most of their exporting. Which are the countries that would be up for the biggest price tag?
Oh, it's difficult to tell. I don't have the exact data on that. But in a sense, it's almost irrelevant, because what we're dealing with right now is an industry that has delayed action for decades. It's only 5 years ago that it set a first ever initial strategy to reduce emissions from shipping. This year is the first revision of that strategy, and it is probably the most important one, because right now we still have a chance to align the industry with a 1.5 or a future with no more than 1.5 degrees of warming. Now, think of it this way. You go to the doctor and the doctor tells you you've got cancer, but says you are going to have through chemotherapy, you're going to get radiation, it's going to be painful, you're going to get really uncomfortable and really quite sick because of this, but this is the best medicine that we have. would you start negotiating with your doctor on timelines and on cost? I would argue not. And that is exactly what is happening now. Some countries say it is too expensive, we need more time, we need to this and that. But right now, we do not have this. If by the end of this week, we do not have a strategy that is unequivocally 1.5 degree aligned, we will have lost that opportunity. And that's why it's so important that, yes, we need to ensure that countries who are too poor to afford this transition, that they are helped. But we have to make sure that we have that full package of a clear target, the measures that we need, and the assurance that this transition will be equitable, fair, and just, to allow those countries that would otherwise be left out to fully back this proposal.
So does it need to be fully backed? Does this have to be a unanimous decision?
Well, the IMO, like many other UN organizations, has somewhat shifted away from voting on proposals. What they want is to get to a consensus in the room to make sure that afterwards no country can say, yes, but that's all very fine, you agreed that, but we didn't vote for this, so we're going to go rogue and ignore all this. So the first objective is really to get a consensus, and that is what's on the table. So we need to get a strategy that is palatable for everyone and not just to the majority.
Yeah. You know, if Australia talks about, you know, working with the Pacific nations and being sort of constructive with the Pacific nations, is it important for them, therefore, to back this?
I would say it is, because these Pacific nations, they look at the data that are being published on the climate crisis, but they also look at what Australia is doing alongside what it is saying. And as a country, it's quite important to walk the talk and make sure that, you know, when it comes to backing a proposal like this, when it comes to, you know, keep on exporting coal and gas, that these things are in line with what Australia is saying in the region. Because it's quite clear that we have to really step up what we are doing in terms of both fossil fuels and the shipping industry as a whole, because otherwise, I don't believe Australia can be a credible partner for the Pacific.
Yeah, Christiaan, really appreciate your time and your expertise on this. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.